Harvard is the ultimate symbol of intellect and prestige. Founded in 1636 with an endowment of $41.9 billion, murder is one of the least likely things to come to mind when Harvard is mentioned. Yet, every institution with the lengthy history of Harvard is bound to have skeletons in its closet. Indeed, one of these skeletons, the murder of Jane Britton, laid out in the open for the world to see for nearly 50 years, casting a shadow over a university that was so often bathed only in light. Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. Jane Britton was a graduate student in the Department of Near Eastern Archaeology at Harvard University. Her father was the vice president of Radcliffe College, and her mother was an esteemed scholar of medieval history who taught at Radcliffe. Her future in the hallowed halls of academia was practically inscribed on her birth certificate. She attended the prestigious Dana Hall School in Wesley, and in addition to her affinity for academic study, she enjoyed horses, painting, as well as playing the piano and organ. As an undergraduate, she attended Radcliffe, as Harvard was not yet fully a coeducational institution. Harvard, in fact, has an intriguing history when it comes to the admission of women. It has, in ways, been both ahead of its time and in others painfully behind in this department. Radcliffe was established in 1879 as a sort of female equivalent to Harvard. And by 1943, the women of Radcliffe were able to attend Harvard classes. In 1963, Radcliffe students began to receive Harvard diplomas signed by the presidents of both colleges. In 1970, Radcliffe and Harvard held joint commencements, and some dormitories began to jointly serve both institutions. By 1972, all dorms had become fully coeducational, and in 1977, women were finally considered full students of Harvard University, though their diplomas were still signed by both presidents and included Radcliffe on them. It was not until 1999 that the word Radcliffe no longer appeared on diplomas earned by female graduates of Harvard. In this way, it is clear that Harvard afforded early higher educational opportunities for women, but continued to treat their female students as the other, all the way up until 1999. Britton graduated magna cum laude from Radcliffe with a degree in anthropology in 1967. She was immediately accepted into Harvard's graduate program for anthropology, which at the time was quite the achievement given Harvard's slow-changing attitude towards women and their ability to be, quote, Harvard material. Jane's particular academic interest was in Near Eastern archaeology, and she was one of several graduate students who went on a dig in southeastern Iran, led by the chair of the archaeology department, Stephen Williams. It is believed that this dig unearthed the ruins of Alexandria Carmania, a fortress which was taken in 325 BCE by Alexander the Great. Britton and her fellow graduate students' exploits were chronicled in an article in the Harvard Crimson dated November 12, 1968. The project lead, one C.C. Lamberg-Karlofsky, mentioned Britton by name in recognition of her contributions to the dig. Back at Harvard, Jane resumed her normal life. She lived in a fourth-floor apartment of a Harvard-owned building on University Road that sat 2 blocks away from the Harvard Square. She typically did most of her studying at the university's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. While her studies took up most of her time, Jane also enjoyed painting pictures of animals in her apartment and had 2 pets, a turtle and a cat. She had a boyfriend, who was a fellow student in her department named James Humphreys, who also went by Jim, and was close friends with Donald and Jill Mitchell, also students in the anthropology department who lived in the apartment next to hers. She had, in fact, played the organ at their wedding ceremony. It is clear that Jane's social circle rested almost entirely within the anthropology department at Harvard, which is not uncommon for graduate students due to the demanding nature of PhD programs. The building Jane lived in was the subject of some controversy in contemporary newspapers. Many of them had described the building as an unsafe and unclean place to live. One particular New York Times article had called the building, quote, seedy and roach-infested, with peeling paint in the hallways. Just 5 years prior, in 1963, Beverly Sammons, then a graduate student at Boston University, had been raped and murdered in her apartment, located in the same building. Her crime is still unsolved, though it is believed that she is one of the 13 victims of the Boston Strangler. An article in the Harvard Crimson reported that the, quote, littered and dingy building had no locks on the outside doors, despite repeated pleas from the tenants to install them, along with a buzzer system to further restrict entry to their guests. In that same article, Jane's friends, the Mitchells, stated that Jane's door specifically was, quote, almost impossible to lock. While the apartment itself was clearly not in the best state, the area surrounding the apartment also added an additional level of concern. An article in The Tech, MIT's student newspaper, identified the area around Jane's apartment as the scene of several recent muggings. By January of 1969, Jane found herself at a pivotal point in her PhD studies. She was just one general exam away from being able to begin work on her doctoral thesis. General exams for all of the Harvard anthropology doctoral candidates were scheduled for January 7, 1969. An article in the New York Post stated that Jane had already been failed on the general exam by Professor Lamberg-Karlofsky. This would be one of her last chances to pass the exam, and a second failure would mean that her career in academia could be in trouble. With so much riding on that general exam, it was peculiar that Jane did not show up. Her boyfriend, James Humphreys, called her multiple times in an attempt to get a hold of her before the exams began, but he was not able to reach her. Following the exam, shortly after noon, James went to Jane's apartment. Her door was unlocked, and James let himself in. He found her lying face down on the bed, with her nightgown pulled up over her head. James thought that she might be sick, so he went next door and asked Jill Mitchell if she could take a closer look. When Jill did, she realized that Jane was in fact dead, her head bloodied from multiple blows with a blunt object. James and Jill called the Cambridge Police Department immediately. The police arrived quickly and set about collecting evidence. They found that Jane had been raped before she was killed. Later that evening, an autopsy was performed on Jane's body, and the medical examiner found multiple lacerations to the head, resulting in multiple skull fractures. He also discovered bruising on her arm. Her death was ruled a homicide by blunt force trauma, which had occurred roughly 10 hours before the body was discovered, placing the murder at roughly 2 a.m. on January 6th. Nothing of value was missing from Jane's apartment. From the shape of Jane's head wounds, it appeared that the murder weapon had a point. However, investigators were unable to determine exactly what had been used to end Jane's life. Leo Davenport, the head detective on Jane's case, was quoted as saying, quote, "It was something sharp, like a hatchet or a cleaver." Speculation would later turn to a 4-inch by 6-inch stone with a pointed end, which Jane had taken as a souvenir from her dig in Iran. The pointed souvenir was missing from the apartment, and police had found no weapon in the apartment. Police did note a set of fingerprints, which did not match Jane or anyone else who the investigators knew had been in the apartment. Final autopsy results failed to produce any new information. The Middlesex County DA, John Droney, stated, quote, "We know nothing more than we knew about the murder when we started. There is no suspects," in an article that ran in the New York Times. While the official word was that the police had no leads, canvassing the building had produced a few things that the police were following up on. A child in another apartment in the building had recalled hearing unusual noises on the fire escape that evening. Another neighbor of Jane's told police they had seen a man who he described as about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds, running away from the building at 1:30 a.m. These leads, too, never turned up any notable developments in the case. Due to the high-profile nature of the case and Jane's status as a student at Harvard and the daughter of two prominent figures in academia, her story received national media attention. The New York Times ran several articles in the weeks following the murder. It was the first assignment for United Press International reporter Michael Widmer, and the case received so much interest that newspapers as far away as California carried Jane's story. A good deal of the reporting focused on one very unusual aspect of the case. Jane's body, along with the floor, walls, and her ceiling, had been sprinkled with red ochre. In the course of their investigation, the police had discovered through an interview with Professor Stephen Williams that red ochre was utilized in funeral rites by ancient Iranians and many other cultures around the world. This fact, along with the way Jane's clothing had been used to cover her body, and the fact that no valuables had been removed from the apartment, led to much speculation that Jane had been murdered by someone who knew her from Harvard, perhaps with ties to the archaeology department. Professor Lamberg-Karlofsky called the idea that someone from Harvard had murdered Jane, quote, completely fabricated and without foundation. Yet, Dr. Williams gave a list of 100 students and faculty from the department who might have had knowledge of the use of red ochre in funerary rites. Most of the 100 testified at a February grand jury hearing, which had been expedited, as many were slated to leave the country for digs in the upcoming months. Jane's friends did not believe that anyone had the motive to murder her, and short of combing through the anthropology department, the investigation was hitting some tough sledding. The Cambridge police did elect to film Jane's funeral service on January 10th, quote, in case someone in attendance had been involved and gave themselves away by their behavior. Detectives also talked to or attempted to reach out to anyone who Jane mentioned in her diary. 3 days after Jane's murder, the Cambridge police announced that they had recovered the stone from Jane's apartment, but they would not say where. Chief James Reagan stated during a special news conference that from then on, detectives working the case would need his explicit permission to disclose any information surrounding the case. This restriction was put in place due to what he had called, quote, inaccuracies in reporting on the case. The media also engaged in much speculation regarding the relation of Jane's murder to other murders in the area. The Boston Strangler had claimed 13 victims in close proximity to Jane's apartment from 1962 to early 1964. And while Albert DeSalvo had long ago confessed to the murders and had been in a mental hospital during Jane's murder, it was thought by many in the local media that there was more than one killer who had been acting as the Boston Strangler. The murder of Ada Bean on February 6th, less than a month after Jane had been found dead, bore many similarities to Jane's case and only fueled media's speculation that the streets of Boston were once again being stalked by the Strangler. Police would not release any information regarding any kind of link between Jane and Ada's murders and those of the Boston Strangler. Due to the police holding on to any news on the case, the media began speculation on the active counterculture movement in the area, which was very present in Cambridge. A friend of Jane's, who had attended Radcliffe with her, told the New York Times that, quote, she knew a lot of odd people in Cambridge, the hangers-on and acid head, who you would not call young, wholesome Harvard and Radcliffe types, to the point that she attended parties and got along well with them. The media fixated on this angle, and it was postulated that perhaps whoever had killed Jane had been under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs, popular with the counterculture of the time. Rumors surrounding the case were commonplace, and while Dr. Williams was quick to dismiss them, one crop of rumors was worth noting. These were rumors concerning friction among the team who had attended the dig with Jane in Iran, which may have given rise to a motive for murder. Williams dismissed these rumors, stating that nothing more serious occurred on the trip than the sort of minor tensions that happen within a group living and working closely together for an extended period of time, specifically noting, quote, complaints about too much tuna fish as an example of their trivial nature. One thread of these rumors in particular concerned Jane and the professor who had failed her on the general exams previously, Dr. Lamberg-Karlofsky. A New York Post article written in 2020 detailing the main thrust of the book We Keep the Dead Close, written by Becky Cooper, contained a recollection from Peter Rodman, a PhD student at Harvard around the time of Jane's murder. Rodman recounted to Cooper that, quote, Jane had threatened one member of her general's committee that she would expose the affair they had been having if she didn't pass. It was Dr. Karlovsky who was at the heart of this rumor. Cooper recalled that Karlovsky did not seem bothered by the rumors that he was a murderer. They, in fact, only served to enhance his already dark, intimidating aura. Karlovsky certainly made a compelling suspect. He was known to be pompous and imposing, sometimes roaming the halls of Harvard in a cape. He was also Jane's faculty advisor at the time of her death, and the aforementioned failure he issued stood as a black mark on Jane's otherwise very impressive academic record. In addition to his proximity to Jane and the tension caused by the general exam, he had been present on the dig in Iran. The New York Post states that during the trip, Dr. Karlovsky took a keen interest in Jane, and though he was married, past history suggested he was not against pursuing female students. The other evidence that seemed to suggest Karlovsky as a likely killer was the spreading of the red ochre over Jane's body. Certainly he would have had the knowledge needed to mimic an ancient Iranian burial rite. As compelling a potential killer Dr. Karlovsky makes, police investigated him thoroughly. No one could place him at the crime scene, and a grand jury heard all evidence relating to his involvement in Jane's life and chose not to indict him. In fact, Dr. Karlovsky was still teaching at Harvard at the age of 74 in 2012, when Becky Cooper, who would later go on to write We Keep the Dead Close, sat in his class, contemplating his involvement. According to Cooper, Dr. Karlovsky lived under a cloud, having never been arrested or truly cleared in Jane's murder. While Karlovsky was not indicted, another potential suspect was heavily considered, Jim Humphreys, Jane's boyfriend. Jim made a compelling suspect, as the crime scene indicated that someone Jane trusted or knew could have perpetrated the murder. No valuables were taken, and there was no sign of struggle or forced entry. The night of her murder, Jane had enjoyed a dinner with Jim. However, she left and went home alone, stopping by the Mitchell's apartment for a drink before going back to her apartment. Jim was even made to take a lie detector test by investigators. Ultimately, Jim was eliminated as a suspect, as no evidence implicated him. Following the initial investigation and its many frustrations, detectives were not able to construct any promising leads, and eventually, Jane's case went cold and fell from the attention of the police, the media, and the public. The case was never closed, and media coverage going forward was very limited by the police continuing to refuse to release any original records on the case. The evidence the police had gathered during the investigation was well preserved, and once DNA testing became available to investigators in the late 1980s, they did test the semen which the killer had left behind. No matches to known offenders at the time were made. Additionally, the DNA was tested again in 2006, and again, no matches were found. By the time Becky Cooper began to take interest in the case as an undergraduate at Harvard, the case was as cold as could be. Cooper and others, including Michael Widmer, who had written articles about the case directly following Jane's murder, and Alyssa Bertetto, moderator of the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, made many requests for copies of the investigatory records belonging to Jane's case. Most of those requests were denied, and when police chose to release records, they were often very limited, at times consisting of nothing more than the newspaper clippings of articles written about the case. Even the records contemporary authors had utilized to write their articles were generally withheld. Widmer stated that this was a common pattern for law enforcement in Massachusetts, to refuse to release all but the most basic information about long cold cases. In June of 2017, Widmer, Cooper, and Bertetto all filed lawsuits against the city of Cambridge to force the release of Jane's case files. Their argument was that fresh leads had been generated by the release of information from long cold cases in other jurisdictions. In preparation for the court hearings in the lawsuit, case police and prosecutors began reviewing all the information they had on Jane's case. In the course of this review, they considered having the DNA evidence ran again. The state police believed that some of the newer forensic techniques could process more of the DNA, increasing the likelihood of a match. When they ran the DNA from the case again, they were able to recover enough DNA to perform a YSTR analysis, and thus obtain strings specific to a male depositor. That string came back with a, quote, soft hit on identifiable suspects. Michael Sumter, a convicted rapist who had died in 2001, a little over a year after he was paroled from his sentence for that crime into hospice care for the terminal cancer from which he was suffering. To confirm the match with Sumter's DNA, investigators needed to test the DNA from Jane's case against DNA from another closely related male. This confirmation is needed because the portion of DNA tested by the YSTR remains the same in all males of the same line. Sumter's records mentioned a brother, but his whereabouts by the mid-2010s were unknown. Researching the family on Ancestry.com led police to Sumter's brother, and he provided them with a sample. His sample matched the one believed to be his brother's closely enough to eliminate all but 0.08% of the human male population as suspects. During his lifetime, Sumter had been convicted of 2 rapes, the second of which occurred when he escaped from a work release program he was serving in while serving his sentence for the first. Earlier investigations had found similar matches between his DNA and that from 2 other previously unsolved Cambridge rape murders in the early 1970s, predating his first conviction, as well as another unsolved rape, bringing his lifetime total of known offenses to 5 rapes and 3 murders. Despite the similarities in the Ada Bean case, police do not consider Sumter a suspect there. Further investigation found other circumstantial evidence that connected Sumter to Cambridge in 1969. While he did not live in that city at the time, he had during his childhood in the 1950s and attended first grade in the Cambridge Public School District. Later in his youth, he had been arrested as a juvenile by city police. 2 years before the killing, he had worked on Arrow Street, about 1 mile from the apartment. And at the time, his girlfriend had lived in Cambridge. In 1972, he was convicted of assaulting a woman he had met at the Harvard Square subway station, just a few blocks from University Road, where Jane's apartment was located. At a November 2018 news conference, Middlesex County District Attorney Marion Ryan announced the results of the investigation. Quote, Michael Sumter has been identified as the person responsible for the 1969 murder of Jane Britton. Although Sumter could not be tried due to his death, Ryan stated that, quote, I'm confident that the mystery of who killed Jane Britton has finally been solved, and this case is officially closed. Jane's murder was the oldest cold case in the history of Middlesex County to be solved. Having identified the perpetrator, police set out their theory of how Sumter had committed the crime. As one of the witness accounts at the time had suggested, despite the building's deficient security, he had probably used the fire escape to gain access to Britton's apartment. Toxicology reports from the autopsy had found that while Jane's blood was alcohol-free, her stomach had a 0.08% alcohol contents from the Mitchell's sherry, suggesting that she had died before it could be metabolized, within a short time of returning to her apartment. Once Sumter had finished, he went back down the fire escape and fled the building. His height and weight at the time, 5'11" and 185 pounds, were close to that estimated by the neighbor who had seen the man running away at 1:30 a.m. Despite the great significance originally accorded the scattered red ochre, police later concluded that it was a red herring, just flakes or other residue from Britton's painting, as it is a common pigment in paints. Cooper went on to publish her book titled We Keep the Dead Close, chronicling her investigation into Jane's murder and its long-standing place as a dark stain on the cultural history of Harvard. She was given full access to Jane's case file following the discovery of Sumter's DNA match. While it took nearly 50 years to find her killer, Jane's case was finally closed, and all of the speculation, rumors, and media craze that ensued following her death proved to be fruitless. In fact, it seems that if the investigation had listened to the simple tip of Jane's neighbor regarding a man fleeing the fire escape at 1:30 a.m., they may have found themselves as close to Sumter as they could have gotten. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include the New York Post, the New York Times, and the Harvard Crimson. This episode is sponsored by Harvard Wisdom, a new publication by Sunha Paul Kim, sharing the collective wisdom of over 170 Harvard graduates. For a full list of our sources, as well as links to our sponsors and contributors, please see our show notes. Please rate or review on your chosen app and follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.